Hello. So this little video is going to be one about conversations and presentations and how to use fewer words to say more, actually. So this can apply, as the title suggests, either to when you're talking just directly to people in a conversation and when you're doing a presentation in front of a conference or a room full of people or on Zoom, like this one. So I'm Krista Bedwin. I have a Bachelor of Education and a Bachelor of Science. I used to be a professional chemist, and for about 25 years, I have also been a professional editor and teacher. This is a picture of what I look like. So I included two profile photos because what we're kind of considering in this presentation is whether you should be quiet or whether you should talk, and when you should talk, how many words you should use. So I kind of put these two photos so you can see what I look like, and also so you can think about those two aspects of your own personality. You know, sometimes we're all quiet, and it's interesting to think about why we are quiet and when we are quiet. And sometimes we have a lot to say, and sometimes we say more than maybe we meant to say. So hopefully this little presentation will give you some insight into yourself about how, when it's good to use a lot of words and when you would rather use fewer words. Now, something that is a very interesting point that I think we can all pause and think about now and then, especially those of us who are very achievement oriented, as I am. You know, we're always trying to do our best job, trying to be the most useful member on any team that we are on, make sure we're pleasing our clients, make sure we're pleasing our family and our friends. You know, sometimes our commitment to do the best possible job, and this is terrible for editors because we can always finick and try to be perfect, but you know, sometimes it's not what you did that people remember, it's how you made them feel. So this is a perfect time to stop using words sometimes, and I think women are particularly terrible at this, for apologizing for ourselves. So you know, there's a woman named Christiane in France who taught me art, and she taught me, without using any words at all, to stop apologizing for myself. And it was just in her body language and in her acceptance and in her facial expression that let me know that apologizing for myself wasn't necessary. And using up those words that it takes for someone to apologize is using up airspace that other people might have enjoyed with better conversation. So think about that. Think about the flavor of the words that you're putting into the air and how that's affecting the room as a whole. You know, and I learned that profoundly on a little island in France, just by the body language of the people around me. Now, you can't learn from the body language of the people around you unless you develop observation skills. So try to take a step back and observe rather than just constantly putting out your own energy. You know, sit back and absorb others' energy, observe and contemplate. Now, how much you can be quiet is also about how brave you are. I had some friends decades ago who said there are only two motivations in the world. We either do something out of love or we do something out of fear. And that's a really interesting concept that I will leave with you. Maybe pause this video and write that down. You know, every action that you take is either love or fear. So if you are feeling love and confidence and full of good feelings, you are often brave enough to be quiet. If we are afraid of something, like we're afraid of somebody's idea of us, or we're afraid of somebody's impression of us, or whether they're going to do the wrong thing, or whether the situation is going to go wrong, then we might talk and talk and talk and talk and talk. Is that going to achieve our objective? Maybe sometimes yes. You know, maybe sometimes we could be brave enough to allow other people to do that talking, or even be brave enough to allow some silence, you know, like Christiane did. You know, she taught me with silence. It can be done. You've got, it's for masters. It's not for youngsters, or masters who are youngsters, but yes. Okay, so in this presentation, we're going to talk about, why do we talk too much sometimes? Why would we want to talk less? How can we talk less? And when to talk less? and when to talk more, because we all know the solution is not always to talk less. So we're also going to talk about situations where we should speak up. These contents are not necessarily going to go in order. They're all going to braid together and mix about in this presentation. So first of all, and I encourage you to hit the pause button and really think about this. Which option describes you yourself? A, I often talk too much. B, I usually don't speak up enough. C, I think others need to stop talking so much. Or D, not sure. So which one of these are you? Honestly, pause the video, take a moment of silence and figure that out. Might not be your first answer, might be your second answer. Okay, so these little mice, my trademark mice, are here to remind us that the point of using words and using our speech is to deliver our message better, but it's all about human relationships. So our relationships are our resource in this world. You know, people often think, well, if I only had money, I could do X, Y, or Z. You know, you can do a lot of things without money if you have people. And so it's a really good lesson that our resources are our people. And really, you know, sometimes I think our words aren't doing us any favors. You know, a lot of animal species seem better at making friends than a lot of humans are. So just think about that. Are our words helping form those relationships that make our lives successful or not? So right here, I'm going to talk about when you should use words. This webinar is not a recommendation to be quiet when you have important things to say. Speaking up at the right time is as important as being silent at the right time. I definitely believe in speaking up when things are going wrong. I definitely believe in speaking up against bullying. I definitely believe in speaking up against narcissists. And most or many people in our society are not brave enough to speak up when they should. This webinar is not about keeping quiet at the wrong time. This is about how to keep quiet at the right time to form good situations. It's not saying to always be quiet. There are times to speak up for sure. So, you know, they say sometimes the hero is someone who bravely says the words that need to be said, the unpopular words. So in this webinar, we'll study how to be a person others will listen to. So I know myself when I was younger, you know, when you're female and you're the smart girl in the class, people tend to minimize you a lot. And that's what I did because I didn't know these strategies when I was a younger female at school. And people didn't listen to me and I got used to not being listened to. In this webinar, we'll start to talk about how can you be that person that people listen to? How can you be the person that speaks softly and everybody always pays attention? You know, some people just have presence. If you're tall, white, and male, people probably listen to you. If you're not, let's look at some ways that we can be listened to. Now, here's a guy who's tall, white, and male, but he's definitely a hero. So if you don't know this face of this funny musical guy, his name is Chris Hadfield. He was the commander of the International Space Station. And he's still a very compelling public figure. I've had the privilege of seeing him speak a couple of times in public. Now, the reason that his picture is right here is because one of the most profound things I heard him say is what he does when he goes to a dinner party. You know, he says, if he goes to a dinner party and people ask him what he does for a living, if they don't recognize his face, he'll say, I work for the government, or I'm a public servant, or I'm a teacher. You know, he doesn't say I'm the commander of the space station, because if he does that, he says the conversation's over. He's never going to hear what the other people have to say. And he finds life is way more interesting if he can be stumm, he can be quiet, and the other people talk. So, you know, you gather stories only by listening. You know, you only find out all the cool things that other people do if you listen to what they have to say. So you learn more about the wealth around you, the assets in those other humans, when you hear about their experiences, when you hear about their passions, you know, ask about their garden or their pets. Or, you know, I know there's one lady I know locally, she just looks it's so stereotypical, but you just think she's a little gray-haired lady. And, the more I talk to her, the more adventures and travels and authorities and experiences she's lived through. So many stories to hear. And that's what's the richness of life. The richness of life isn't in flipping on the TV and everybody sitting there staring at it. The richness of life is listening to what other people have to tell us. And so you can only do that if you ask the questions. If Chris Hadfield can do it, he's one of the most famous people in the world. Definitely, we want to do it too. So now, how to talk less in a one-on-one conversation is to get the other people to talk more. Now, my dad was a project manager in his career, and one of the things that he loved to do, he said, was to sit at a meeting table, and instead of just him, like, he had already crunched out all the engineering of a project, and he knew what direction things had to go in already. He had all the papers on the table. But what he preferred to do was get the client or get the other people on the team to say what needed to be done. So how can we do that? Get the other person to talk more. You can ask them about themselves or their ideas, or, like my dad would do, prepare leading questions about the project. You can lead people kind of, as they say, down the garden path in the direction you want them to go. But also, in leading them down that garden path, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. You might find there are things on the path that you didn't know. So you can't, if you go in with a hard and fast objective, you might fail. If you go in knowing, okay, we're going to walk down a path together and hopefully get somewhere we both want to go in this meeting, usually you're going to get a better outcome, usually. And again, there's some being silent. As a teacher, one of the most difficult things in a webinar like this, or webinar, particularly when I have people in the room or people online with me, is to be quiet and let people think their own thoughts. That's one of the hardest lessons that I learned as a high school teacher, is to you have to be quiet sometimes to let people think about what you said. So embrace those silent pauses. You have to make space for the other person to fill. And another really excellent question that one of my colleagues told me about meetings is, what if you left, one of these, a super important meeting, you're talking one-on-one to your boss, or you're talking to your partner, or a business meeting. What would happen if you went to the meeting and you left the meeting and you didn't actually say everything that you thought you had to say? So of course, important meetings, you prepare up front, you've got notes. We do this in business, we do it personally. What if you didn't say everything on your notes? What if you had all your notes, but then you went with a priority on listening rather than on getting all of your own words out? It's a really interesting question to ask yourself before you go into any important meeting. There might be questions you need to ask because you might need to leave with certain pieces of information. But what if you don't say every piece of information that's in your head? It's an interesting thought exercise. I hope that you pause this and write that down. And now this is a very interesting one. Most of us do not listen with the intent to understand. We listen with the intent to reply, which prevents us from actually listening. And I'm glad that I knew this quote from doing these lessons, because this definitely came up in a new relationship I had, a new love relationship. And I said to my boyfriend, you actually didn't listen to what I said. You just wanted to listen to reply. I just wanted you to listen to me. And he did understand that. And I think we've gotten better at listening to listen, like just being conscious of the fact of how we converse can help us get better at it. And this is a very good lesson too. And another thing, which this I think takes more work on some parts than others, but when you're listening to people in person, it's important to look at them, to not be multitasking on our phones, to not be multitasking by looking out the window. Actually say or give some verbal cues. And on the telephone, this is very important, and as well, so that the other person knows that we are listening. Taking some notes can be really handy, or asking questions to make sure that you've understood. Repeat back to the person, I think what you just said was, and then repeat what you think they just said. And they say, no, that's not what I meant. But by you repeating that back, then you get a chance to really, just put everything else aside and focus in. And it's, we're such multitaskers nowadays, electronics, busy in public, get somewhere quiet and actually focus on that person. Put your cell phone somewhere that you can't see it. If it vibrates, it's not going to bother you and distract you, and really focus in. It's so easy to just let your mind wander, especially if you think the other person's not going to say something interesting. You have to make a commitment to this. Now, if you're in authority, for example, Chris Hadfield ran the International Space Station. He doesn't need to yell, right? He gets up at the front of a room, everybody gets quiet because we want to hear what he has to say. So again, my dad always said, walk softly and carry a big stick. And this was, again, a lesson from school teaching as well. The more you yell at a classroom full of teenagers, the louder that classroom full of teenagers gets. There's no way to out yell a classroom. Well, I tried in my early teaching career. It can be done, but it's difficult. It's much more effective to learn how to get quiet and to carry a presence, which I'm going to talk about later on in this webinar. So in a group situation, when do you want to talk less in a group situation? So when you are the boss, if you can, some meetings, you might have the goal that you have to deliver certain information, right? However, often a good boss is actually interested in listening. What do we need to do different? Can you guys please tell me how things are going on site? Can you let me know how things are going with such and such a client or such and such a colleague? It's good to ask. Now, I would also like to say, when you are the tallest person, or when you're a man, chances and statistics show that the tallest men talk the most. And unfortunately, a lot of people that aren't paying any attention to their instincts listen to the tallest man the most. However, research also shows that the most effective, most successful groups do better at listening to everybody. They don't just give the stick to the biggest guy. Now, the fourth rectangle here on the bottom right is the most important time when to talk less. And it's the people who usually talk the most, when you don't know what you're talking about. So if you are an intelligent person, you have probably noticed that it's the people who seem to know the least who yell the loudest. And we definitely see this on the internet all the time, right? The people who seem to be struggling to understand, or the people who are just learning something, talk and talk and talk and yell and insist and try to force their viewpoint on others, and they're often not correct. So try to be humble. And if you're not sure about what you're talking about, if you're new to a team, if you're uncertain, try to listen and you might learn something. It's awfully hard to learn by talking. You learn by listening. Now, when do you talk more in a group? So when you have a question. So one thing I observed early on in my career is a lot of people in our online groups would often write me offline and say, I didn't want to ask in the group and look stupid, but XYZ, or I didn't want to answer and look stupid. A lot of times people are being over modest, and this was almost always women, almost every single time. If you have good ideas, or even if you just have interesting ideas and you're modest, say them in the group. And especially in online groups, when it comes to job sharing. So as a freelance editor, when jobs come up and I have them to offer, I give them to people that I know because they've talked online before. So I have developed relationships by those people over the past 20, 25 years because we have shared ideas over that period of time. when I post a job ad and then people reply and, oh, I've never mentioned anything before. Well, they've never given of themselves, right? Speaking up is giving of yourself, and it's a brave act to speak up. So do speak up when you have something to share or something to offer. And you know what? You can always offer, if you have nothing else, sympathy, kindness, praise, support, consideration, confidence building. Even if you know nothing, you can be kind. And in that being kind, you'll probably find you know more than you thought you did. Now, when to talk more in a group, and I spoke about this at the very beginning, if you're in authority and you need to correct false ideas, you should definitely speak up. If someone is bullying someone else, you should speak up. If someone is making racist groups or groups against LGBTQ people, or jokes against women, or jokes against anybody that are cruel, you need to speak up. That's my belief. So now, good interactions are a balance between listening and talking. So Chris Hadfield knows a lot and has a lot of experience, and he could talk nonstop. That's why people pay him a lot of money to stand up and talk, and we're so thrilled to go see him, right? But even he loves to listen. And so there's always a balance between listening and talking. A way that you can think about a conversation is like a piece of music. So I know not everybody reads music, but if you do read music, and I'll try to use my mouse here to show you, here there are some breath marks after the third bar here, these things that look a little bit like commas. In fact, sometimes they are commas like this. So these are like a big breath and a small breath. So a comma in a sentence is the place where you take a breath. And a good conversation, so you can see here we have harmony, right? Two voices moving together, and then they can sometimes move apart. And this person, right, speaking at a different cadence than the other person. So the thing is, if you are aware, you know, some people are tone deaf and they get together with other musicians and they can't make the notes go together because they don't listen to the other musicians. If you've played music, this is making sense to you. But in a conversation, it's the same thing. You need to listen to the other person to have that conversation go harmoniously, just like playing music. So be conscious of those pauses and conscious of when you should just hold the long note and let the other person shine or take the solo. So now I'd like to look at, why do we talk too much? I've certainly talked too much in the past, and I can think of a number of people who talk too much. I'm sure we all can. So write some reasons in the chat window, or if you're watching this as a video, pause the video and think about, why do you talk too much? Pause the video and write it down. Here are some answers that I came up with. Why do we talk too much? So again, this is the love versus fear thing, right? Anxiety. If we feel we need to control the situation, if we feel that the other person is going to say things we don't want to hear, or say things that we don't like, or say things that are going to hurt our feelings, we might talk and talk and talk. If we're afraid that the other person's not going to talk and we're afraid of silence, and I haven't really figured out why some people are afraid of silence, but some people are. But, you know, if you don't allow the silences, especially in group situations, so I'm particularly thinking of group Zoom calls, which, you know, have been very common since the pandemic. So it's a wonderful way to get to know people, the cocktail parties of our age, you know, germ-free. Everybody's got their own glass of wine at their own house. If you don't allow silence, you can't let people speak up. So in a way, that's also a lack of awareness. Those people who can't allow those silent pauses are not being aware of the other people in the room. And so I find the Zoom calls can be very frustrating, because sometimes you can't hear people you want to hear from, because the people that are afraid of silence just keep yammering on, and they'll talk about anything, the weather, the train schedule, sports, you know, past experiences other people weren't involved in. So just disharmonious, disharmonious. So we want to be loving. And in order to be loving, to be a good lover, you have to be aware of the people you love. So that's what creates good manners, right? Good manners is about consideration and about thinking about the other person's experience. So if you're thinking about the other person's experience, and I know that this is part of why people talk a lot, because they think it will be awkward if there's a bit of silence. But really it's not. You know, there needs to be a bit of a balance. And if one person is always jumping in and not letting the other person come up, you know, and if you're worried about silence, you can say, well, Sheila, how about you? Like, that's a really fantastic shirt you've got on. Where did you get it? I mean, that's a very low bar, but I mean, that's one I always use with cashiers. You know, note something about their appearance and give them a compliment. It creates a nice little space. It draws them into the conversation. So how can you stop talking too much? So first of all, realizing that you talk too much is half the battle, because it's not fun for anybody else to have to say, you know, Jeremy, I wish you'd be quiet. Because that's a hostile thing, and nice people don't like doing that. But if you yourself can realize that you have a habit of putting too many words in there, well, then you yourself can decide to take a step back. It's not easy and it takes practice, but you can do it. You know, take a deep breath in, count to 5. Count to 5 before you start filling up a Zoom room with words. See if somebody else will speak in that 5 seconds. Resolve to be self-aware. So as an act of love towards other humans and an act of bravery for yourself, just decide that you're going to count to 5 before you keep filling up groups with words. If you notice, you know, actually, so when I was doing my education degree, something we did was you were supposed to sit in a classroom and we actually had like a piece of paper and you counted observations of behaviors that certain children were doing or behaviors that the teacher was doing, and actually count it. So maybe, you know, join some Zoom meetings. They're all over the place to join, and count up behaviors. You know, just maybe observe other people with your camera off, or observe yourself, or take a recording and see how many minutes did you talk compared to the other people. Is it balanced? Did you ask other people questions, or did you just fill up the space with words? Stop yourself. So really, this is an exercise of bravery. It's a martial art almost. It's a martial art. Just like controlling our breath, we are able to control our words, but it takes practice, right? For those of us who talk a lot, it takes practice. Just like it's an act of bravery for those of us who don't talk enough to speak up. So, you know, like when we say in yoga, when you're on your yoga mat, the people who are already very flexible need to work on getting strong, right? Because we're already super flexible, we need to work on our muscles. The people who have really strong muscles usually need to work on being more flexible. So we all have work to do, and we all have things that we're already good at. So some of us already talk too much, some of us don't talk enough. So being aware of both sides of that teeter-totter is how to find a good balance for yourself. Now, another very interesting thing is that these verbal tics, such as and like we all have some. My favorite is I swan. That's one I heard when I was very young from some people in Ontario. They just said I swan all the time. But you know what? When I was recording my videos for my UBC course, one of the video interns took one of the interviews I had with a very respected man, and she took all of his ums out. And it was actually, she pared it down too much. The thing that the does is it gives your listener a chance to think about what you said. So it's not always bad that somebody says, because maybe it's a gentle sort of herd behavior that makes us comfortable. And of course, certain ones are tribal, right? When somebody's saying right, or like, you know what I mean? That can be comfortable if you're within your tribe group. On the other hand, if you're not within your usual little herd of people, those verbal tics can seem foreign. And if they're seeming foreign, they're probably inhibiting conversation. So it's something, again, it's something to be aware of. So if you know that you say or like or write a lot, then your training would be to learn to pause. And so this video, this link that I have at the bottom here is a really good little article about how to just pause instead of saying those tics. And this is a little excerpt from that video that I just am sharing because it's an excellent little piece of information here. So despite how pauses make you feel at first, they actually make you sound calm and collected. And so if you take a pause, and this part of the article is particularly speaking about standing up in front of people and giving a talk. So if you stand up, and this would be something I could also see Jane Goodall do when she stood up at the front, or Chris Hadfield, or any accomplished, Barack Obama is excellent at it, right? He just stands up there at the podium, takes a deep breath in, right? Collects his thoughts, okay? As long as the pause is not longer than 5 seconds, all the audience is going to do is hold their breath and wait for you to speak. That silence allows them to calm down. Taking that pause will calm yourself, and they just get the audience excited. They build suspense. So if you want to read the rest of this slide, pause the video. Otherwise, I'm moving on. What happens when we talk too much? Put some consequences in the chat. So listeners get sleepy. And this is also like happens when we're with our friends. If we talk on and on and on, listeners just switch off, right? Or they might not be willing to listen. I end up feeling like my time is stolen. I don't like people to steal my time. And if they're talking and not allowing me to talk, in fact, there's certain Zoom calls. I belong to a coaching group, a health coaching group, and some of the people in that group will just talk and talk and talk. And as soon as I see their name, I mute the video because I know they have this habit. So if they tried to build a relationship with me, they've ruined it by their inconsideration of how much they talk. So it's good to be aware. So if you talk less, you get more love and more enthusiasm and more buy-in. So that's what I was talking about with my dad around the boardroom table, right? Instead of him saying what we should do, he would lead the client to say, let's move this direction on the project. So again, you have to be brave. You have to be trusting that and you have the confidence to know where you're going and what you want. And if the client leads you down a path that you're not sure that you want, are you going to be willing to consider it? Are you going to be able to explain why they should come back your way? Right? By thinking this out and rehearsing, you'll be brave enough and strong enough to do that. So people listen better and engage better and focus more strongly on you, and will have better action on your follow-up items if they're fully present at the table. And if you don't steal their time by nattering on, then they will focus on you. Okay, so how to talk less. So I'm going to give some lessons from my teaching experience here. The first one, this is something that I think I got taught when I was working at Golder Associates. So if you're teaching adults, and actually I also used this when I was teaching school, everybody in that room is bringing experience to the room. So for example, when I was teaching math at high school or chemistry, I would have students put their hand up and be like, oh, my tutor taught me a different way to do this problem. And I would say, fantastic, come up to the board, Sam, and show us how she told you how to do it. And that way we've got new information and we've got a new conversation. It's way more exciting than just having one voice teaching all the math in one direction in my terrible handwriting on the board, right? I do the same thing when I teach courses, when I put together online courses. I try to bring the idea that there's multiple experts by having other textbooks in the room. So I bring interviews if it's just a fully online course, or if I'm doing a course with a company. I love it when supervisors and other people that work in the company engage in that conversation, because everybody brings information to the table, and it's more engaging and more exciting when people are involved. So I'm including this picture because there's something about the woman in the black coat that just makes me think she looks like the most quiet person in that picture. And to me, she also looks like the person that's the smartest. I don't know why, but the person that's jumping up and down and making the most noise, it looks like they aren't actually the smartest. So be aware of that too. It's not always the noisiest people, and I've already addressed that point, who have the most information. It's often the quiet people who have the best information. And so as a teacher, a presenter, or any kind of a person in any kind of authority, it's our job to notice those quiet people. And again, that's a skill that you learn over time. So having senior people in the room and providing that empty space for them to tell stories and give examples. So if you're making Zoom presentations and if you're delivering them live to groups of people, what I like to do is have put 20 minutes in your presentation. That's empty space. Now, how do you do that without fear? Because maybe nobody's going to speak up, and maybe you need to fill those 20 minutes. So what I do is I make my presentation, end at 30 or 40 minutes. And then after the end point, I have more examples. So if nobody was to speak up, if I have a dead silent room full of people and nobody's going to converse with me, then I still have enough slides to run longer. But if I can get those stories and engaging examples and real life, especially when you're teaching to companies, if you can get people in the group to share the stories, that's compelling. And those are very good lessons. So use that textbook. If you can discuss with seniors before time that you want their input, that of course stacks the cards in your favor, right? And if you say, hey, the more you chip in on this, so for example, if I'm teaching how to write reports to a group of engineers or scientists, if their own bosses jump in and confirm what I'm saying or argue with something I have to say, then that's fantastic, because that engages people, engages their brain, and then their bosses are on board. And then so present to working groups. So if possible, I love to present to groups of people who work together, because then those water cooler conversations continue after, so that learning multiplies. So if your crowd does not seem to be speaking up enough, you can also form groups. So this again depends on the less confident people are, the less they might be willing to speak up. And I belong to one group in particular, the Mediterranean Editors and Translators, and I belong to another one, the English language teaching group out of the UK, that are just awesome on using these Zoom groups or Wonder Rooms so that people can be in just a group of 5 or 6 people, which is quite optimal for people speaking up, or even 4 people. Like small little 10-minute conversations with small groups can really get people stirred up and talking, as long as you don't have that problem of one person talking too much, which often occurs. So have people discuss questions or examples. So have focused things for people to discuss in the group, and then that should hopefully lead to productive conversations. And then you bring it back to the whole group. So if you provide those questions and prompts, people will get engaged. And so these Zoom breakout groups are also just great for experienced professionals, because if you have been to more than 5 professional conferences in your life, you've probably already realized that most of the excitement of those professional conferences is not the technical skills that you're getting, it's the other colleagues that you're meeting. So as a freelancer, of course, and I think the very first professional conference I went for a beer with a woman named Sheila. She handed me work that spun into more work, that spun into more work, that spun into more work. So actually the greatest value to even my first conference was the person that I drank beer with. Now, granted, I had met her online beforehand, but the opportunities in conferences and in Zoom meetings And even in something that seems to be a very content heavy lesson is often in letting people talk to each other. So again, we need to be aware as the instructor to step back and allow people to speak to each other. We give them the time and the place. We give them maybe some guided questions. But I know with the Mediterranean editors and translators, we start with the guided questions. Some groups will follow the questions very strictly, and other groups will just go free form, and depending on how well we've gotten to know each other, because after a certain number of years, you get to know a lot of people in the group quite well. So allow that, it's allow versus fear. So what's the worst thing that can happen if you don't say everything you have to say in this meeting? Even if it's a Zoom meeting or even if it's a training session, you can send follow-up sheets. You can set up a follow-up meeting. Don't be afraid. Just be confident of your objectives and know what your contingency plans are. Now, this little diagram is for me to tell you a story about when I went to Sacramento, California. So I was doing this little tour all along the West Coast, going to different offices and teaching reporting and writing. And when I got to Sacramento, they weren't glad to see me. The bosses weren't interested in what I had to say, and they didn't come to the session, and they sort of told people to go. Offered them free lunch, right? People show up for lunch. But when I walked into this room, bad vibe from the start. And people reluctantly gathered around the boardroom table, and some of them were giggling and laughing and on their cell phones. And as I said before, yelling over that kind of behavior doesn't work. You're not going to get respect, and you're not going to get focus. So what I did was I was silent, and I stared at the young women who were giggling and on their cell phones. And everybody else in the group stared at them. And eventually they put them away. And so when I started my talk, they obviously hadn't been introduced to who I was or why I was there. But about 5 or 6 minutes in, they realized that I had something to say. So another thing is, how you don't just accept a conference room how it is when you show up. My favorite presentation is probably the U-shaped kind of presentation, because then you can see everybody and make a pretty direct line with everybody, if you can use the U-shaped thing. Whatever arrangement your tables are, so with a U-shape, the instructor can kind of stay in one place and have a connection, a line of sight with everybody. If you are forced into a configuration where people are at tables or more far flung, it's very good to walk around the room, because just as the instructor, putting your body closer, so if you have one of those walk around microphones, that increases, it's a little bit of a fear response going back to school, but it's also that like a tiny little bit of fear in a good way that makes people pay attention. So be aware that where your body is focuses where their attention is as well. So what about on Zoom? You need to think about the group sizes and the group compositions and cameras on. So if you can have cameras on, people are going to focus much better. And I even know this as a student, doing yoga classes with people that I know, doing yoga classes with, one of my studios in Vancouver. If I have my camera on, I do a much more focused yoga class than if I have my camera off. I'm like, yeah, I have every right to put my camera off. I'm a paying customer, but you get more out of it with your camera on, And so when people are in a breakout room, it's like at a pub table, right? Because they're staring at just 3 or 4 other people. They're going to be more focused. If you've got 20 people, people are more likely you can just flick your camera off and nobody's going to know. So these are, think about these things. Think about how are you going to compose the groups of certain size, because you can just do breakup groups that are randomized, or you can focus them. So if you were doing a corporate group, you might want to select those groups beforehand and be really strict with them. I've never done that as yet, but you could do. And I put breakout rooms or like pub tables, because if you've ever been to a pub quiz, and again, I think it was the English language teachers in UK that taught me this, but doing a pub quiz with those breakout rooms and then going back to the big group is very much like doing pub quiz with your own pub table and then being in the whole room. So use Zoom like you're in a pub. Use Zoom, think about Zoom in its real life context, because it is actually working very well to connect people. So make use of the tool and the technology. Now, conference talks, another point, and it also applies for Zoom. If you're disorganized, you will talk too much, almost guaranteed. So make a presentation such as this one, and then edit it and fix it and practice it. And then you'll be prepared, and you probably won't use too many words. The more you know, the less words you use. This is true of writing a report. This is true of writing a letter. This is true of giving an elevator pitch. So one of the professors I work with says that when he wants his students to write a paper, before they sit down to write the paper, he has them present their research to the group. And in providing a short little presentation for their research group, just by the act of getting their ideas down to a few minutes to say at a meeting, they refine their ideas. So it's kind of like, you have all your ideas, that's like slag iron, right? You mine the slag iron and you've got this big lump of molten metal with impurities in it. And then the editing process or the practicing process is like hammering it to make carbon steel. And if you've never seen a Japanese samurai sword made or carbon steel made, look on YouTube and you'll see what I mean. So you start with that big lump of slag, dirty metal, and you hammer it and you hammer it and you hammer it in the fire, and you see the sparks coming off it and you see the impurities coming out of it. And the more you hammer and the more you practice, the more refined and sharper your blade. And that's exactly what you also want to do with your talks. So fewer words on slides is always better. Images help to organize the facts. So rather than putting a lot of words down, we keep it concise. And a photo rather than a lot of words is great. And also images. So you can put words into a table, like that table we saw before about the 4 different ways to talk. So tables can help to organize. Now, if you're presenting at an academic conference, particularly, you're very likely to get somebody stand up at the microphone, or a community thing. Somebody stands up the microphone and they just ramble on, right? They don't even have a question. They just want to tell a story. So there's something called parking, which is when you say, and you may have to cut the person off even. And I am in favor of cutting people off who ramble, because the people who are rambling are stealing precious time from others who may have valuable things to share. And so there is a real art to stopping someone who's rambling and saying, thank you very much for sharing that idea. That's not quite on the topic that we're wanting to talk to right now. And we have other people who want to ask questions. So we're just going to park that and let's talk about that after we wrap this up. So you can actually use the jargon of park. We're going to park that idea for now. And that's a pretty well-known corporate language to say, we appreciate your idea. It's a great idea, but we're not going to talk about it right now. And again, a lot of people avoid conflict and just let that person ramble. I'm not in favor of that. I say stand up to the bully, and people who steal others' time are doing a form of bullying. Narcissism doesn't make the other people happy, and it does not add value to the other people at the conference. So stop it. Stop it and let other people talk. So if you would like to argue with anything that I've said in this presentation, I welcome you to write me and complain, or write me and give me praise. That's an even better way to build a relationship. And, if you have questions, or you'd like to see me do a little webinar on something else, or, whatever, feel free to find me on any of these places. I'm the only Krista Bedwin on the internet, I think. So I'm pretty easy to find. You saw my picture at the beginning. I hope this was helpful. Share as much as you like, and have a great day.